though I was recording the conversation. That's the part he never saw coming. Not the lawsuit, not the attorney, not even the court date. The part that unraveled everything, the part that changed the entire trajectory of what happened next, was a small, quiet decision I made 30 seconds before he sat down across from me at that coffee shop on a Tuesday morning in March. I'd set my phone face down on the table, voice memo, already running. I want to back up, though, because to understand why I did that, why I even thought to do that, you have to understand what the 3 months before that Tuesday looked like. I was 29. I'd been with my boyfriend for 2.5 years. We met at a friend's birthday party in Austin, which sounds cliché, but most real things do when you try to summarize them. He was funny. He was attentive in the beginning. He had a way of making me feel like the most important person in whatever room we were standing in, which I later learned was less a quality and more a skill, something he practiced. His father owned a private logistics company based out of Houston. Not tech billionaire money, but old Texas money. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself because everyone already knows it's there. His father had started the company in the 80s, built it through 2 recessions, and by the time I entered the picture, it was worth somewhere north of $400 million. My boyfriend was the only son, the heir, effectively, though no one ever used that word out loud. I didn't think about any of that for most of our relationship. I was a physical therapist. I had my own apartment, my own car, my own student loans I was still paying off. I wasn't looking for anything except someone I actually liked spending time with. And for a while, that's what we were. I found out I was pregnant in November. I was alone when I took the test. It was a Saturday morning, and he was at a hunting trip with his college friends somewhere outside San Antonio. I sat on the edge of my bathtub for a long time, not crying, not panicking, just very, very still. The kind of still that happens when your brain needs a moment to catch up to the information in front of it. When he got back Sunday night, I told him. He didn't say anything at first. He sat on my couch and looked at the coffee table. I watched his face go through something, I don't know how else to describe it, like a door closing, slowly, 1 inch at a time. "Are you sure?" he finally said. I told him I'd taken free tests. He nodded. He said he needed a few days to think. I said, okay. I thought that was reasonable. I thought it meant he was processing, which is what adults do when something unexpected happens. I gave him his few days. What I didn't know was that in those few days he'd called his father. I found that out later. At the time, all I knew was that when he came back to me after those few days, something had shifted. He was still polite. He was still technically present. But the warmth was gone, replaced by something careful and rehearsed. He told me he didn't think he was in a position to be a father. He said he cared about me, but that this wasn't something he planned for. He asked if I'd thought about other options. I told him I had. I told him I was keeping the baby. He nodded again with that same closed-door expression. He said he understood. He said he'd be in touch. 3 days later, his father called me. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered because I answer numbers I don't recognize, an old habit from years of waiting for insurance callbacks at work. The voice on the other end was measured and warm in the way that powerful men learn to sound warm without actually being warm. He said he'd heard about my situation. He used the word situation. He said he wanted to meet, just to talk, because he believed in handling things privately and he thought I seemed like a reasonable person. I should have known then. But I was 8 weeks pregnant, I was scared, and nobody had taught me what it looked like when money started moving in your direction. We met at a restaurant he chose, upscale, midweek lunch, the kind of place where the tables are far enough apart that no one can hear your conversation. He was already seated when I arrived. 60s, silver-haired, the kind of tan you get from actual outdoor time rather than a booth. He stood when I approached. He shook my hand. For the first 20 minutes, he was almost charming. He asked about my work. He asked about my work. He asked how I was feeling physically. He said he hoped the first trimester hadn't been too hard on me. Then he set a manila envelope on the table between us. He said he wanted to be direct. He said that his son was not in a place, emotionally, professionally, to take on this responsibility right now. He said that these situations, when handled properly, didn't have to be painful for anyone. He said that inside the envelope was an offer. He said the number was $250,000, with the understanding that I would terminate the pregnancy and sign a document confirming that my boyfriend and I had never had a relationship that resulted in a child. He said it the way you'd explain a billing correction. Calm, practiced, like he'd given this particular speech before. I looked at the envelope. I didn't touch it. I asked him what would happen if I didn't sign. He smiled, small, careful, and said he hoped it wouldn't come to that. He said things could get complicated if they needed to. He said his family had resources and relationships that I probably didn't, and that in his experience complications tended to resolve more favorably for the party with more resources. I said, "I'll think about it." He said he'd give me a week. I drove home, pulled into my parking garage, and sat in my car for 45 minutes. I didn't cry until I got upstairs. That night, I called my older sister. She's the person I call when I need someone to think clearly on my behalf. Because when I'm upset, I go quiet and circular, and she goes sharp and practical. I told her everything. I told her about the envelope and the number and the thing he said about complications. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You need to call an attorney tomorrow morning, not next week. Tomorrow." I told her I didn't know any attorneys. She said she'd find one. By 10 the next morning, I was on the phone with a family law attorney whose office was in North Austin. She had been practicing for over 20 years. She had a voice like she'd heard every version of every story and was not going to be rattled by mine. I liked her immediately. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me 2 questions. First, had I signed anything? I said no. Second, did I have any documentation of what had been said to me? The offer, the threat? I said not yet. She said, "That's the first thing we fix." She explained to me that what I'd been offered, money in exchange for terminating a pregnancy and signing a non-disclosure, occupied a very specific legal and ethical grey zone. It wasn't necessarily criminal on its face, but the implied threat that followed, the suggestion that complications would arise if I refused, crossed into territory that was worth documenting very carefully. She also told me something I hadn't known, that in Texas I could file for paternity establishment before the child was born. I could request a court-ordered acknowledgement of paternity, and once the child arrived, I could pursue child support based on my boyfriend's actual income and his family's documented assets, where applicable. She said, in high-income cases, child support isn't symbolic. She said Texas had its own guidelines, and while there were caps under the standard formula, courts had discretion in cases involving significantly above average income. She said we would document everything. We would be methodical. We would not be in a hurry. I asked her what I should do about the father's follow-up call, which I was expecting in about 6 days. She said, "Take the meeting, but this time record it." Texas is a one-party consent state. That means I could legally record a conversation I was participating in without notifying the other party. My attorney walked me through it. She said to keep it simple. Voice memo on my phone, face down on the table, running before he sat down on the table, running before he sat down. I asked his father to meet again, this time at a coffee shop closer to my apartment. I said I wanted somewhere a little less formal. He agreed without hesitation, which told me he thought the second meeting was a closing, not an opening. He arrived 3 minutes early. He was dressed down. No tie, open collar, like he was trying to seem approachable. He ordered a black coffee. He smiled when he sat down. He asked if I'd had time to consider the offer. I told him I had some questions first. He said, "Of course." I asked him to clarify what he meant. The last time we'd met, when he said things could get complicated. I asked him specifically what kinds of complications he was referring to. He paused. Then he said that he simply meant legal matters could become drawn out and expensive and that he wanted to spare everyone that experience. He said it again. Resources and relationships. He said his family had connections in the Austin legal and business community that could make certain processes move more slowly or create more friction than necessary. I nodded. I said I appreciated his candor. He slid the envelope across the table again. This time, he said the number had been revised. He said they were prepared to offer $300,000, finalized within 30 days of a signed agreement, with a standard NDA attached. I looked at the envelope. I did not touch it. I said, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not going to sign anything. I'm going to have this baby, and I'm going to file for paternity and support through the court. I wanted to meet today so you could hear that directly from me. The warmth left his face the same way it had left my boyfriend's, 1 inch at a time. He said I was making a mistake. I said maybe. I picked up my phone, dropped it in my bag, and left. My attorney filed the initial paperwork 9 days later. I won't walk through every step of the legal process in detail because, honestly, a lot of it was tedious in the way that legal processes are tedious. Forms, waiting, more forms, phone calls with very little new information, longer waiting, but I'll tell you the parts that mattered. The first was when my boyfriend was formally served. He was at a work lunch at a restaurant in the Galleria in Houston. His assistant texted him that there was someone asking for him in the lobby. He came out thinking it was a delivery. It was a process server. My attorney told me later that he called his own attorney within the hour. The second was the deposition. This was roughly 4 months into the process, and I was visibly pregnant by then, about 6 months along. I sat across a conference table from my boyfriend and his 2 attorneys and answered questions for 3 hours. I wasn't nervous in the way I'd expected to be. I was just tired. He didn't look at me directly for most of it. At one point, I caught him looking at my stomach and then looking away quickly, like he'd touched something hot. The third was the recording. My attorney had advised me early on that the recorded conversation with his father might be relevant, and when the time came to introduce it as part of the supporting documentation in our case, the other side's response was notable. The father's attorneys argued it was taken out of context. They argued the language about resources and relationships was a general statement about navigating legal complexity, not a threat. They argued a lot of things. What they couldn't argue away was the offer itself. 2 meetings, 2 envelopes, a revised dollar amount, and a request for an NDA in exchange for terminating a pregnancy. On tape. The judge in our case was a woman in her mid-50s who had, I was told, presided over family court in Travis County for over a decade. She had the quality of someone who had heard every version of this story and was not moved by any version of the performance. When the recording was played in the proceeding, she listened with her pen set flat on the desk in front of her, and her face did not change. His father was not in the room that day. My daughter was born in late July, 6 pounds 14 ounces. I named her after my grandmother on my mother's side. She had a full head of dark hair and the most serious expression I had ever seen on a newborn, like she was already composing her response to a question nobody had asked yet. I was in the hospital for 2 days. My sister flew in from Denver and stayed with me for the first week. My mother drove down from Oklahoma City and stayed for the second. I don't know how I would have gotten through those first 2 weeks without them. Not because I was falling apart. I wasn't. But because new motherhood is physically demanding in ways that I had intellectually prepared for and then been completely unprepared for anyway. The court issued its final order 6 weeks after she was born. Paternity was established on the record. My boyfriend, my daughter's father, officially and legally, from that point forward, was ordered to pay child support calculated on his actual verified income, which his attorneys had worked very hard to obscure and my attorney had worked very hard to obscure. and my attorney had worked very hard to uncover. The number per month was not small. There was also a separate finding related to the recorded conversations. His father's conduct, specifically the implied coercive element of the offers, resulted in a referral for further review, and while I won't go into the details of how that resolved, because that part is still not fully public, I will say that it didn't go quietly and it didn't go cheaply for their side. The NDA they had wanted me to sign, I never signed one. Not then, not after. There is no document with my name on it asking me to stay silent about any of this. That was one of my attorney's clearest instructions from the very beginning. We sign nothing that restricts your right to speak. My daughter is 2 now. She has learned to run, which she does enthusiastically and without much consideration for what's in her path. And she has learned to say no with a conviction that I find genuinely impressive. She is loud and curious and sometimes exhausting, and she is the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I mean that in the simple, ordinary, non-dramatic way, not as a redemption arc, not as a silver lining, just as a fact about my life. Her father has visited 4 times. He is not cruel to her. He is also not natural with her. And I have accepted that this may be something that changes over time or may be something that doesn't, and that either way it's not a problem I am responsible for solving. His father has not contacted me since the court's finding. I think about that Tuesday morning sometimes. The voice memo. The coffee shop. The moment I said, "I'm going to be honest with you," and watched the warmth leave his face. I wasn't brave, exactly. I don't want to frame it as bravery because I think that sets the bar too high for what was actually just a series of practical decisions made by someone who was scared but refused to be managed. I had an attorney I trusted. I had a sister who told me to call that attorney the next morning and not next week. I had a recording that said what it said. I had a phone face down on a table and a voice memo already running. That's what I want you to take from this. If you take anything, not the courtroom moment, not the final order, not the number on the support check, the moment that actually mattered was smaller than any of that. It was a Tuesday morning, a coffee shop, and a decision I made 30 seconds before he sat down, that I was going to document this, that I was going to be methodical, that I was not going to let someone with more money and more practice at this rewrite what had actually happened. You don't need to be fearless. You need to be 30 seconds ahead. And you need to know your state's recording laws. Look them up. They matter more than you'd think. I still think about the envelope. Not with anger anymore. That part faded somewhere around the time my daughter learned to wave. I think about it the way you think about a road you didn't take. What would have happened to me if I'd touched it? If I'd let the number on that paper become the thing that decided what my life was worth? His father was a man who had built a $400 million company by understanding one thing very well. Most problems can be solved if you offer the right amount to the right person at the right time. He wasn't cruel, exactly. He was just someone who had learned that money worked, and so he kept using it. The problem, his problem, the one he never anticipated, was that he was sitting across from someone who had already decided the envelope didn't matter. Not because I was noble. Not because I had a plan. Because something in me, the moment he slid it forward, went very quiet and very clear. That clarity is what I want to talk about, because I don't think it came from nowhere. I had spent years in a job that required me to think carefully under pressure, watching a patient's body, reading what wasn't being said, adjusting. I had spent years being methodical in small ways that didn't feel significant at the time. I had a sister who told me the truth even when I didn't ask for it. I had learned, slowly and without realizing I was learning it, that the difference between being managed and being in control of your own situation is almost always information and timing. Not money, not connections, information, timing. When I called an attorney the morning after that first meeting, not next week, the next morning, because my sister said so and I trusted her, that was the decision that changed everything. Not the courthouse, not the recording, that phone call, because it meant that from that point forward, I was operating from knowledge instead of fear. And knowledge in that particular situation was the only thing his father's money couldn't buy away from me. I think about cause and effect a lot now that I'm raising a daughter, not in any mystical sense. I don't believe the universe was balancing a ledger on my behalf. I believe that what happened was the result of choices made in sequence by people who had decided what they were willing to do. His father decided intimidation was a tool. I decided documentation was mine. The court didn't deliver some cosmic verdict. It just processed the evidence in front of it, and the evidence said what it said. What I want my daughter to understand someday, when she's old enough to understand anything complicated, is that integrity isn't something you perform in dramatic moments. It's a thing you've been building in the quiet ones. The phone call you make the next morning instead of next week, the instinct to document rather than panic, the ability to sit across from someone who has a great deal more money than you do and say plainly what you're going to do next. She won't remember any of what happened. She'll only know it through whatever I tell her and through the fact that her name is on a court order that says she belongs to both of her parents, officially on the record, when nobody can revise it. That's enough. That's actually everything.